The first thing I saw was not the collapsed tent, the broken poles, or the canvas flapping helplessly in the mountain wind. It was the blood running down the woman's wrist as she stood in the middle of the campground, smiling as though she had not just lost the last shelter she owned. Around her, strangers hurried to secure their coolers and folding chairs before the approaching storm reached the valley, but she remained beside the wreckage with tears trembling in her eyes. When I rushed over and asked whether she was hurt, she looked at my small green tent, then back at me, and forced a fragile laugh. "Maybe we could share yours tonight," she said. "Unless you're afraid of strangers." Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe kindness can find us in our loneliest moments, forgiveness can rebuild what pain has broken, and hope sometimes arrives through someone we have never met. My name was Callum Hayes, and I had driven 7 hours to that campground because I wanted to disappear without frightening anyone enough to come looking for me. 6 months earlier, my younger brother, Everett, had died in a car accident after calling me 3 times. I had ignored every call because we had argued that morning over money our father had left us. Everett had wanted to use his share to save the family hardware store. I wanted to sell the building, divide everything, and move on. His final voicemail was only 7 seconds long. He said he was sorry, that family mattered more than property, and that he hoped I would call him back. I listened to that message every morning, sometimes 10 times in a row, as though grief might eventually reveal a hidden sentence that could absolve me. It never did. I had come to the mountains carrying a tent, 2 cans of soup, a sleeping bag, and the unbearable belief that I did not deserve to return home. The woman introduced herself as Maren Whitlock. She was 34, with wind-tangled auburn hair, pale freckles, and the exhausted eyes of someone who had been pretending to be strong for too long. The cut on her wrist came from a snapped fiberglass pole, and although it was not deep, blood had soaked the cuff of her cream-colored sweater. I cleaned it with water from my bottle and wrapped it with gauze from my first aid kit. She watched my hands carefully, then asked whether I was a paramedic. I told her I owned a hardware store, though that was not entirely true anymore. The store was closed, its windows covered, its shelves gathering dust while Everett's plans for rebuilding it remained locked in a filing cabinet. Maren nodded as if she understood that there were facts people could say aloud and truths they could not. Together we pulled her ruined tent away from the muddy edge of the campsite while gray clouds crowded above the ridgeline. The afternoon light remained bright beneath them, making the entire valley look strangely divided between beauty and disaster. Maren's belongings fit into a single faded duffel bag. There were 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a paperback novel, an old camera, and a small wooden box she held against her chest whenever I reached toward it. She explained that she had been traveling for 3 weeks, staying at cheap campsites and roadside cabins. She said she was not running from anything, but the speed of her answer suggested otherwise. I offered to help her get a room at the lodge near the park entrance, yet she refused immediately. When I asked why, she glanced at the wooden box and said she had barely enough money for gasoline. The storm had not arrived yet, but gusts tore through the pines, and park rangers began warning campers that heavy rain was expected later. My tent was built for 2 people, though I had purchased it after Everett's death because sleeping alone in a larger space felt intolerable. I told Maren she could use it and that I would sleep in my truck. She stared at me for several seconds before saying she would not take a stranger's shelter while he folded himself behind a steering wheel. Her voice was gentle, but there was pride beneath it, the kind built from years of refusing pity that we carried our things beneath a wooden picnic shelter while the rangers checked the lower campsites for flooding risks. Because the story of our lives was still unfolding in daylight, there was no darkness to hide behind, no quiet night to soften the truth. The sun slipped in and out of the clouds as Maren opened a packet of crackers and divided them exactly in half. She asked why I had come alone. I gave her the easy answer first: I needed fresh air. She looked toward the mountains and said people who only needed fresh air usually brought more food. Something about the way she said it loosened the knot I had been guarding for months. I told her about Everett, the unanswered calls, the voicemail, and the store. I expected sympathy, but Maren did not tell me it was not my fault. Instead, she said regret was cruel because it convinced us that suffering was the same thing as love. She told me that punishing myself would not answer Everett's call. It would only create another life destroyed by the same accident. Her words angered me because they were too close to what I feared was true. I asked what gave her the right to speak as though she understood. The warmth vanished from her face. She looked down at the wooden box and said her husband, Graham, had understood regret better than anyone. 2 years earlier, their 9-year-old daughter, Poppy, had drowned during a family picnic at a lake. Graham had been watching her while Maren walked to the parking lot for sunscreen. He looked away for less than a minute to answer a work message. By the time he saw Poppy's yellow hat floating near the dock, she was beneath the water. They both tried to save her, and strangers performed CPR until an ambulance arrived, but Poppy never opened her eyes. After the funeral, Graham stopped speaking about her. He worked longer hours, slept in another room, and refused counseling. Maren became furious that he would not grieve with her, while Graham became convinced that her tears were an accusation. Their marriage collapsed beneath everything they could not forgive. The wooden box held Poppy's ashes. Maren had taken them from the house 3 weeks earlier after Graham signed divorce papers and moved away. She planned to scatter the ashes from a viewpoint Poppy had loved during a childhood camping trip, but each time she reached a place that felt right, she could not open the box. The campground was her final attempt. The broken tent, she admitted, felt like proof that even the mountain did not want her there. Her voice remained steady until she described the last morning Poppy was alive. Her daughter had complained about wearing a life jacket near the shore. Maren had told her she could take it off for one photograph. That decision had become the sharpest weapon in her memory. Graham blamed himself for looking at his phone, while Maren blamed herself for loosening the straps. They had spent 2 years drowning beside each other, each too ashamed to reach for the other's hand. The wind strengthened, throwing pine needles against the shelter roof. A ranger named Beatrice Cole arrived and warned us that the road leading out of the campground might temporarily close if the creek rose. She advised everyone to move to higher ground near the visitor center. As we gathered our bags, Maren suddenly realized the wooden box was gone. Panic transformed her face. She ran toward the campsite before either the ranger or I could stop her. I followed through the gusting wind and found the box beneath the collapsed canvas, only inches from a stream of muddy water moving through the site. Maren dropped to her knees and grabbed it, but the ground shifted under her boots. She slipped toward the drainage ditch, striking her shoulder against a rock. I caught the back of her jacket before she fell farther. For one terrifying second, her entire weight pulled against my injured knee, and I nearly lost my grip. Then Beatrice reached us and helped drag Maren onto solid ground. Maren sat trembling while I checked her shoulder. Nothing seemed broken, but she had reopened the cut on her wrist. She clutched Poppy's ashes so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I expected gratitude, yet she began crying with a force that seemed to come from every year of her life. She said she was tired of carrying the box, tired of guarding her guilt, tired of waking each morning with no daughter and no husband, and tired of telling people she was surviving when survival felt like a punishment. She confessed that she had left Graham a letter before beginning the trip. In it, she had written that she did not know whether she would return. The meaning was unmistakable. The broken tent had not merely destroyed her shelter. It had interrupted a farewell journey she had not admitted was a farewell, even to herself. That I felt the mountain tilt around me. I had told myself I came there to escape, but I had also left my store keys and legal papers on my kitchen table with a note asking my cousin to handle the sale. I had driven into the wilderness without telling anyone when I would return. Maren and I were not simply two lonely travelers forced together by a storm. We were two people standing at the edge of our own disappearances, each recognizing the danger in the other before admitting it in ourselves. I sat beside her in the wet grass and told her the truth. I said I had not planned to hurt myself, but I had stopped caring whether I came home. I had mistaken that numbness for peace. She looked at me through tears and whispered that perhaps the reason her tent had fallen was not because the mountain rejected her. Perhaps it fell because she was never supposed to be alone that day. The rain began as a silver curtain across the valley, but the afternoon remained bright beyond it. We moved to the visitor center, where dozens of campers waited beneath wide wooden beams and watched water race over the windows. Beatrice gave Maren ice for her shoulder and asked for an emergency contact. Maren hesitated before writing Graham's number. The ranger called him from the office and explained that Maren was safe but shaken. He was 4 hours away. When Maren heard his voice through the speaker, her face crumpled. Graham did not ask about the divorce papers, the missing ashes, or the car she had taken. He asked only whether she was alive. Maren said yes. Then she apologized, not for the accident, but for leaving without giving him the chance to say goodbye. Graham's answer was too quiet for me to hear, yet Maren covered her mouth and sobbed. Later, she told me he had said he never wanted goodbye. He wanted another chance to learn how to live with what they had lost. While the rain continued, I called my mother. We had spoken only twice since Everett's funeral because every conversation ended with silence or blame. When she answered, I could hear a television in the background and the clatter of dishes. Ordinary sounds from a life I had abandoned. I told her where I was and confessed that I had ignored Everett's final calls. She already knew. The police had given her his phone records. For months, I believed she must hate me, but she said she had never blamed me for the crash. She had blamed me only for disappearing afterward. Everett had been arguing with me, she said, but he was also speeding in heavy rain. The accident belonged to one tragic moment, not to one unanswered phone call. Then she told me something no one had mentioned. Everett had recorded another message for her shortly before leaving the store that morning. In it, he said he hoped I would forgive him for pressuring me and that he wanted the two of us to rebuild the store together. My brother's final hope had not been that I suffer. It had been that I stayed up by late afternoon. The storm weakened. Sunlight broke through the clouds and spread across the wet valley, turning every pine needle into a point of gold. The road remained closed, so Beatrice allowed campers to stay near the visitor center until conditions improved. Maren and I carried the surviving tent to a raised clearing. The poles bent slightly in the wind, and she laughed when I struggled with one of the clips. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from her, warm and surprised, as though it had escaped without permission. We set 2 sleeping bags inside, though neither of us intended to sleep yet. The title of our strange meeting had begun with her suggestion that we share a tent that night, but what mattered was not the closeness of 2 strangers beneath canvas. What mattered was that by asking for shelter, she had unknowingly asked me to remain in the world, and by offering it, I had done the same for her. Before the road reopened, Maren asked me to walk with her to the viewpoint above the campground. The rain had washed the sky clean, and the entire landscape glowed beneath the late-day sun. She carried the wooden box but did not open it. At the overlook, she placed it on the stone wall and took out her phone. She called Graham again and told him she no longer wanted to scatter Poppy's ashes alone. She wanted him beside her, not because she had forgotten his mistake or forgiven every wound between them, but because Poppy had belonged to both of them, and so did the grief. Graham promised to meet her there the following week. Maren did not tear up the divorce papers or pretend love could repair itself in a single call. She simply agreed to postpone the ending they had written while broken. Sometimes hope is not a dramatic reunion. Sometimes it is 2 people deciding not to close the door today. That I also made a decision at that overlook. I would return home, reopen the hardware store, and complete the community workshop Everett had designed for teenagers who needed practical job skills. I would hang his photograph near the register, not as punishment, but as a promise. Maren suggested naming the workshop after him. I suggested that she establish a water safety fund in Poppy's memory, something that could provide life jackets and swimming lessons to families who could not afford them. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time she smiled through them. Pain had convinced both of us that memory could only be a grave. Standing above the sunlit valley, we began to understand that memory could also become a bridge. As the final drops fell from the trees, Maren looked at the repaired tent and repeated her earlier question with a softer smile. "So, are you still afraid of strangers?" I told her I was more afraid of what happened when people stopped letting strangers become friends. She reached for my hand, not romantically and not desperately, but with the quiet gratitude of someone returning from a place no one else could see. We stood there until Beatrice called from below that the road would soon reopen. Graham was already driving toward the nearest town to meet Maren. My mother was waiting for my call when I reached home. 2 lives that had come to the mountain expecting to vanish were now making plans for the people they would see tomorrow. Before this story ends, please leave a meaningful comment about someone whose kindness reached you when you were close to giving up, or tell us what forgiveness means to you when the past cannot be changed. Your words may become the shelter another person needs today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. 1 year later, the Everett Hayes Community Workshop opened inside the restored hardware store. Maren and Graham attended together. They were not the same couple they had been before losing Poppy, and they never pretended to be. They had begun counseling, withdrawn the divorce petition, and created the Poppy Whitlock Water Safety Project, which had already provided hundreds of children with swimming lessons and properly fitted life jackets. Near the store entrance, beneath Everett's photograph, we placed a small piece of Maren's broken tent pole inside a glass frame. The plaque beneath it read, "Some things collapse because they were never strong enough. Others collapse so we will finally ask for help." Maren stood beside me during the opening ceremony, watching children learn how to use tools at the workbenches Everett had once imagined. She smiled through tears and said that the worst day of her journey had led her back to her life. I looked at my mother laughing with Graham near the doorway and understood the same was true for me. The tent had fallen, the storm had passed, and 2 grieving strangers had shared far more than shelter. They had shared the fragile, life-saving courage to stay.